Hello. Hi, can you hear me? I'm Erica Mallon. I am the executive director of the Aspen Institute's arts program, and we're very thrilled to have you here today. Um, and we are so honored to have master photographer, educator, MacArthur Genius Award winner, um, Dawoud Bey, in conversation with Stephen Nelson. And I am going to read this paper. Stephen, you are the professor of African and African American art history at UCLA, as well as the National Gallery of Arts professor at the Center for Advanced Study in the Visual Arts. You have their bios. But today, as you may know, Dawoud's The Birmingham Project is on exhibit at the National Gallery, and Dawoud and Stephen are going to be talking about this project, as well as Dawoud's project on the Underground Railroad, Night Coming Tenderly Black. Dawoud also has an incredible book out calling Seeing Deeply, which is a beautiful retrospective of your work, Dawoud. I highly recommend it. I also want to thank our trustee, Michelle Smith, and our Society of Fellows and our Art Circle members who support Aspen and the arts program. Michelle Smith and the Robert H. Smith Foundation support in particular this series, so we are grateful to them. The purpose of the arts program is this. We believe that artists are the soothsayers of our society and have been for centuries. And our purpose and mission is to champion their work and to bring their voices to the forefront of all conversations to make the greatest impact that they can. Um, these programs and our other programs in the arts program is to really focus on how we can bring their unique and humanist approach to all issues so they can educate, inspire us, move us, make us feel, and to seek change and make impact. So we are extremely pleased to be doing this work and to be working with artists and experts like Dawoud and Stephen. Um, and part of the mission, and of course, the founding principles of Aspen, is to convene people from a wide range of fields and expertise. I can't name everyone, and I have a little list, but I do think it's important that everybody knows who's in the room when we convene like this. We do have many from the National Gallery of Art, and we do want to congratulate them on its appointment of Kaywin Feldman, its first woman director in its 77-year history. We have many representatives from the government, from arts institutions, nonprofits, community organizations, and universities, from the U.S. Department of Justice, Education, NEA, Kennedy Center, Commission on Fine Arts, the African American Museum, American History Museum, the Smithsonian, the Phillips Gallery, artists from large and small institutions and community organizations supporting artists. We also have urban planners and creative placemakers, law, health, and veterans organizations. We have educators from high schools and universities, including the Corcoran School of Art, Georgetown, Montgomery, American University, George Washington, Johns Hopkins. And we're also very pleased to welcome today the president of Howard University, Wayne Frederick. Um, thank you all for coming. I wanted to just put this a little bit in context. At our last roundtable in October, we spoke with award-winning activist, architect Michael Murphy, who unveiled his ambitious vision for a nationwide gun violence memorial in an effort to humanize this epidemic. Today, through the genius of Dawoud's work, we look at how an artist can humanize the past and in turn give us an opportunity to inspire us as to think about ways forward. So again, I am honored, we are all honored to have Dawoud Bey in conversation with Stephen Nelson. And thank you, and let's begin.
Great. Thank you. Okay, thank you, Erica, for that lovely introduction. And also, I want to thank the Aspen Institute for inviting us here. It's a wonderful opportunity. And I feel like, I mean, Dawoud, I feel like, we get to sort of publicly do what we already do in private, and that's like have lunch and talk about art and talk about your art, and so that's what we're going to do today. So welcome to our lunch table. All right, and so you have a number of images with you that that really focus on your last two projects, right? The Birmingham Project and Night Coming Tenderly Black, and the gist of this conversation is reimagining history, visualizing history, but you also have a few things there in your arsenal that gives us a little bit of insight as to how you got there. All right, so why don't you talk to us a little bit about your trajectory?
Well, this is where the Birmingham Project begins. Auspiciously enough, it begins with James Baldwin. And it begins with James Baldwin visiting the church that I grew up in Queens, New York, in Jamaica, Queens, to give a talk. And I didn't attend the talk, but my parents did. And after Baldwin's talk, there was a reception held at the church. And at the reception, they were selling this book that you see here, The Movement, that had been published by the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. It was published as a fundraising vehicle for the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. Baldwin may well have been on a book tour for this book. I don't know. But it was a book of photographs of and about the civil rights movement that the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee had collected, along with a lot of photographs by Danny Lyons, who some of you may or may not know, who was the official SNCC photographer. And these photographs were given to Lorraine Hansberry, and Hansberry was asked to quickly write a text that could weave these photographs together so that they could be published in book form. So my parents bought the book, and then they brought it home. And that's kind of like where the beginning of the Birmingham Project is. Them bringing this book home and not talking to me about it. Right. They didn't say anything, because I was 11 years old, and if you tell an 11-year-old that you must look at something, that's probably the wrong approach.
Right, yeah, not so good.
I probably have ignored it for as long as possible. But they trusted my innate curiosity and just left it on the coffee table in the living room where I could see it. And I opened the book up, and there were a lot of horrific photographs in that book. Lynching photographs, pretty much all photographs of all the things that my parents had up until that time done their best to protect me from. It all came streaming into my life through that book. And this photograph in particular of Sarah Jean Collins, who was the older sister of Addie Mae Collins, who was one of the 4 girls who was killed in the dynamiting of the 16th Street Baptist Church. That particular photograph just seared itself into my imagination. I don't know at that point that I entirely intuited that part of the reason was probably that I was very much the age of the girl in the photograph. That may have been what triggered that intense response. But this photograph seared its way into my psyche. You could say that there was my life before this photograph, and there's my life after this photograph. So with that as the context, fast forwarding maybe 45 years, more or less, I have to do the math.
I'm not good at math.
I have to do the math on this. But after having seen that photograph initially when I was 11 years old, one morning, about 45 years later, it came flashing back to me. Something had happened that I can't exactly recall to shake it loose. I do know that my son had been born by then. This may have factored into it also, who knows. But I was just, the expression that I always use, you know, is this expression to sit bolt upright in bed. But I never really knew what it meant. But that morning, I literally sat bolt upright in bed, and that picture of the girl lying in the hospital bed came flooding back to me.
So you'd not seen it between, say, when you were
not at all.
11 and when you thought about it, 45 years later? Or?
Yeah, I never forgot it, but I didn't think about it. So it was parked somewhere in my psyche.
Sure.
And from that, the only thing that I could figure out to do with that was that I need to go to Birmingham.
Okay.
Yeah, I need to go to Birmingham because clearly I have not forgotten this. This is still with me. And I need to go to the place, 16th Street Baptist Church, where this happened. I need to, as an artist, those are the things that prompt me in terms of what to make work about. So my thought was, I need to go to Birmingham. I need to make some work. I need to do something with this.
But then Birmingham, and I would love to hear you talk about your process there, because I think a lot of what is so fascinating and so deep about that work is the process. But your work up to this point, right, up to your being bolt upright in bed, was these sort of very amazing analytical and emotional portraits of people that then sort of take a turn in 2012, right, and they become this. And so can you, when you talk about sort of getting to Birmingham, can you say a little bit about how the work sort of suddenly took on?
It's interesting because I went to Birmingham with absolutely no idea about how I might respond. So I started spending time there just making what you might call visual notes. These are the equivalent of my drawing. Yeah, just sketches, visual notes, trying to familiarize myself with the place and starting to acclimate myself to the place, to also begin to meet people. So that people in the community would become familiar with my presence prior to anything that I might do. I didn't want to be a kind of suddenly parachuting presence that was there and then I was gone. So I started spending time in Birmingham, and then once I knew that I wanted to make work there, as I have done with a number of projects in the past, I contacted the museum in that city, which in that city there are two institutions. There's the Birmingham Civil Rights Institute, and then there's the Birmingham Museum of Art. So I found out who the curator was at the time at the Birmingham Museum of Art, contacted them, had no prior relationship with them or the city for that matter, and told them that I was thinking about making work there that in some way would be related to September 15th, 1963. Might they be interested in partnering with me on this project? And perhaps, depending on what came out of it, mounting an exhibition of what resulted. So that was my initial trying to get the work situated before it was done, with the conversation with the museum. Because that's how I think about the museum. Museums have been my partners in a number of projects since 1993. To me, museums are kind of laboratories. They've been my laboratories. They've been my collaborators. I don't just think of them as the place where the work that I make is exhibited. I've done a number of projects in which I work with museums to bring the work into being. That is, then they were interested, but we're talking hypothetically. They said, come in and speak with us, and we'll see, exhibited in that space. So because I have that kind of relationship and history with the museum, I contacted Birmingham Museum of Art. And they were interested, but we're talking
Were they kind of like-
hypothetically.
Yeah.
They said, come in and speak with us and we'll see. That conversation went on for a number of years. And then in one conversation, the then director of the Birmingham Museum of Art, Gail Andrews, she said, you know, we've been talking about this for a while. But you should know that 2013 is going to be the 50th year of this moment that we've been talking about.
Right, right.
And since we've sort of kind of agreed to do this,
Right. And so when you
That
agreed,
would be-
when did you agree? How was this in 2009, 2010?
probably 2011.
So, okay. So then the process, and I think it's important to note, the process is really long.
Very long,
And
very
s-
long.
so then
I've
what-
been visiting there for maybe
Yes.
5 years off and on. Because I was in the midst of other work, even while I was visiting Birmingham, thinking about what the next project was going to be.
Right.
Once she said 2013, we're going to do this, and I know that I have to now turn this idea into a formal proposal that they can then present. You know, artist Dawoud Bey is going to do X, and then there's always these questions of allocating a space. How many works are there going to be? What size are they going? Things that I can't even possibly know, but I kind of imagine the work before I make it. So what I started doing in order to try to get a sense of what I might do, spending time looking at Birmingham, going to thrift stores. I started finding these photographs in thrift stores, various visual representations of African Americans in photographic and other forms, just taking in as much information as I could. And then with an introduction to the Birmingham Civil Rights Institute, I started doing more focused research on that particular day, the context surrounding the moment of September 15th, 1963. And it was from my research at the Birmingham Civil Rights Institute that I found out a few things that I didn't know, including the fact that not only had the 4 girls been killed that day, which I knew, and which I think most people know. But what I didn't know was the 2 boys had been killed in the aftermath of the violence that began that morning. Once I knew about the 2 boys, I knew that I had to include them in the shape of the work, whatever that work was going to be. And I started to think about how the 4 girls, their presence was a kind of mythic presence. The 4 little girls. It was very abstract. It wasn't palpable. It was just this, almost sounded like a girl group, the 4 little girls. You know, it was very mythic. And one of the things that I wanted to begin to figure out was how to give those 4 girls and these 2 young boys a more palpable presence. What does an 11-year-old black girl look like? What does a 14-year-old African-American girl look like? A 13-year-old boy and a 16-year-old boy. So the initial idea that I got was to make portraits of young African-Americans in Birmingham who were the ages of the 6 young people who had been killed.
How did you find them?
Through the museum, we did extensive outreach on social media. I did a lot of visits to schools, schools where the appropriate age group would be middle school, and first year of high school would be the 16-year-olds, visiting high schools. The mayor invited me to speak before the city council because the city council meetings were broadcast live, and they seem to have had a large viewership in Birmingham. So the mayor invited me to speak, hanging out in greasy spoon restaurants, kind of like all of the above, just letting people know. Because ultimately, after I decided to photograph young people, it still felt conceptually incomplete because I was reaching for something that I hadn't quite done before. You know, this idea of making history tangible, visible, resonant. That was not the way I had been working prior to this project. So I was trying to figure out both the conceptual and the formal shape of the work. As the museum is asking me how many of them are there going to be, what size are they going to be.
And when are you going to be done?
When are they going to be done? We need to figure out, which gallery we're going to allocate for this. But I'm kind of used to those questions.
Right.
I'm used to those questions.
So then how do you put your finger on it? I mean, we could look at sort of the finished product, right? Because the finished product is, if finding those young people is the first draft, right? If we're talking about a sketch into a first draft, field work, which is ostensibly what you're doing, then when did you get to the second draft?
Well,
What happened?
the second piece came when I realized that the photographs of young people alone did not embody the narrative that I wanted to convey. Was that these young people had been killed and there was an entire life that they had not been allowed to live. And there were, the way I thought that I might visualize that was by making photographs of African Americans in Birmingham who were the ages that they would have been had they not been killed. It took me a while to figure that out, like how does one visualize the passage of time? And I thought by photographing these young people and photographing older adults, and then bringing them together formally as diptychs. Each diptych would in fact embody 50 years. Once I figure that out, now I'm ready to start working. And then in terms of where to make the photographs, I have done projects in the past where I've used the museum as a temporary studio, setting up in the museum and working, rather than just thinking of the museum as a place where the work is shown. I've often thought about the museum as being a place where the work can be made, and that work can be made and then later shown there, kind of collapsing those two things. Here it took on a different significance because the Birmingham Museum of Art, during the time of the work that I was making, during the era of the Civil Rights Movement, like all public institutions, the Birmingham Museum of Art was a segregated institution. Black people could not visit the Birmingham Museum of Art until eventually they designated one day a week as Negro Day. And then black folks could visit on that day. So that was one piece of social history. The history, the social space of segregation, of which the museum had been very much a part of that history. And then there was the other piece of history that I wanted to bring into the conversation, which was the black communal space of the church. So I chose two different locations as the place where the work would be made as a way of wrapping those two different pieces of history around the subjects. The church that I ended up photographing in, Bethel Baptist Church in Collegeville, is actually the church that was pastored by Reverend Fred Shuttlesworth, a very activist minister in Birmingham, Alabama. And Bethel Baptist Church is actually where the Southern Christian Leadership Conference was formed. It was a very activist congregation. So I met with the current minister of Bethel Baptist Church, who immediately understood and embraced what it was I was trying to do. And the church was in the midst of an historical restoration which he said by the time I came back in a few months would be complete, and he would be more than welcome to allow me to use it anytime.
Great.
Which of course gave me chills because
perfect timing.
I was the first one in the restored Bethel Baptist Church, because it's not used for church services.
Right.
They had built a new, larger church. So I decided that, and I asked people to come whichever one was most convenient for them, because Collegeville is a little ways from downtown Birmingham. There were people who lived out that way for whom that would be more convenient, and there were others for whom it would be more convenient to go to the Birmingham Museum of Art. One of the interesting things that I found from the outset, given the history that the Birmingham Museum of Art had with the older subjects, the adults, when I told them that I was going to make their portraits, and we set up with my assistant a time and a date for them to come, the first couple of times what happened was I would be in the museum waiting for the person to come, and then the time would come, and then the time would pass. And then I told my assistant, call them, see how they are, see if they need a ride, see what's going on. And she would call, and the person would say, I'm there. And I was like, you're there? Yeah, I'm there at the museum. I said, well, I'm at the museum, we're on the second floor. I'm on the second floor. And then I said, well, where exactly are you? Well, I'm at the Institute. They were at the Birmingham Civil Rights Institute.
Ah.
Which to them is the
Is
museum.
the museum. The museum is not the museum.
They have a closer relationship with that institution than they, if you say, meet me at the museum, they're going to go to the Institute.
Right.
Which made sense, because if you were an adult who grew up in an era where that museum was not accessible to you, that was not your first thought about where to go when someone said, come to the museum.
Wow.
And that was interesting.
So then you get the perfect place, perfect time, and you get these amazing diptychs, all right? Which, as you sort of beautifully and brilliantly show the person who might have been, the young person who might have been the age when you were shooting, right? It's an incredible visualization of history, but it's also an incredible visualization of loss. And I hadn't thought about this until I was like bathing this morning. And I'm thinking about your pictures and thinking about your pictures. And when you lose someone, you always wonder what they would look like now. So my dad died when I was a teenager. What would he look like at the age of 91? And you're just like, that never goes away. And so in that visualization, was that something that you were thinking about or dealing with, or did it ever appear for you?
It was interesting because I put them together after the fact. So none of these people either knew each other, with maybe one or two exceptions, and they were not in the place at the same time. So I was making Polaroid instant prints, actually Fuji instant prints of each subject before photographing them. So I had that as a reference. And then if someone came in after photographing a child, and I have that as a reference print, I've made the photograph. If an adult came in kind of looking like there might be a relationship between them, I would then put that person on the appropriate side, because I couldn't photograph them both on the right-hand side. I have to kind of make the pieces as I'm going along, and then hope that there is some either gestural, physical, or dispositional relationship between them, so that there is something of a tangible relationship that triggers the imagination around this narrative that I'm trying to create, that this young 11-year-old girl could have been this 61-year-old woman. I didn't want to, in selecting the subjects, strain the credibility of that, even though I was not trying to make exact likenesses, even though periodically someone would show up. Like a young boy would show up and the man would just look exactly like it could have been his grandfather. Sometimes there were uncanny physical resemblances, but it was gestural. It was dispositional, temperamental, some tangible thread of a relationship that would allow each one to sit next to each other in a way that was not potentially disruptive, you know. And that was a very difficult.
It's powerful.
Because when it worked, it absolutely worked. The interesting thing about the project is that I have other photographs that I made of individuals, but because I couldn't find a second one to go with it, I couldn't use them. That's the reason that there are 32 of them. There are actually more individual photographs, but each photograph had to have one that it could be paired with to make a complete piece. Now, periodically, something like this would happen, where there would be two subjects, and you know, they look to be an uncanny relationship between them. They look like they could be related, and then when something like that happened. When I've made portraits, I've never completely made up the gestural language for the person. I just ask them to, you know, make yourself comfortable. But I'm mindful of the fact that I then have to shape that into something. In the past, that was shaping that into something that was a kind of amplification of someone's idiosyncratic, you know, gestural vocabulary. We all have it. You're all sitting differently right now. All of your hands are placed differently. Like that's your behavior. You know, the way, like what I noticed, you know, the way you're touching your chin with the pinky right here. Like we all have wonderfully expressive, you know, we all have wonderfully expressive things that we do that I can't make up. It's something Richard Benson, my professor at Yale, once told me that I always remembered. He said, you know, Dawoud, the most interesting things that are going on in the world, you can't make them up. And I think that's true for portraits. You have to be alert and responsive to, and then shape that to the shape of the picture, to the rectangular space that I have to work with. So I don't remember which one I did first. The man was probably first. And then when the boy came, I don't want the gesture to be a mirrored kind of gesture, but I want him to relate. And he probably sat with his arms out. I know I need him to bring the arms in so that they fit the frame, but I'm also aware that there's some resemblance between the tip of the head. And so I gently kind of nudge the subject into the kind of gesturally expressive, you know,
so you're in the
place that I need them to be. Well, and sometimes it was uncanny. Sometimes it was just enough of a suggestion.
Well, it's in the work. You're in the work and out of the work, all at once. You're in the process of making, but also sort of looking. You're the third-person narrator, and yours is sort of omnipresent, and just sort of thinking about the math of the production, right? And making it work, because it still has to work somehow.
Yeah, because I'm aware of where I need to end up, even as I'm in the process of making. And I'm aware, too, that once the person is in front of the camera, all of that has to momentarily disappear. And I just need to create a quiet space in front of the camera in order for the person to perform themselves.
Yeah.
And I don't need to talk about the context too much with them because they were all invited. They all knew why they were there. They all knew what the project was. They knew that they were there because they were the age of someone who, an interesting thing that happened initially. I had been photographing for several weeks, and no older African American men had bothered to come forward to participate. I had spent a lot of time in a barber shop downtown, and I knew that a lot of the men in the barber shop were the age that I was looking for. I knew that the barber Don himself was the age that I was looking for, but they didn't volunteer. And I quickly understood that my coming back and making this work was stirring up a lot of feelings that people would best like to have undisturbed. Like, do you want to sit in front of the camera and remember that traumatic moment?
Yeah.
Because for the adults,
Well, they were there.
they were the
They were
ages.
there. Yeah.
They were the ages. Some of them knew some of those young people who were killed. And now here comes the photographer who wants to make a photograph of you as a kind of memorial to that. Do you really want to go there? And for the men, it was no. And I finally had to get someone who had much deeper roots in the community than I did to reach out to those men. And that was Reverend Carolyn McKinstry. And she was, I guess you could say, there were 4 girls in the restroom who were killed. The 5th one, Sarah Jean Collins, was a distance away from the war.
Right.
So she suffered serious injuries but was not killed. And then there was the 5th girl, Carolyn McKinstry, who left the restroom just moments before the explosion went off. She was the Sunday school secretary who had to turn in the report to the church secretary so that whatever happened in the Sunday school could be read during announcement time. So she left to go turn in the report because she realized it was late. And just as she left, the explosion went off. She is the one who reached out and began to encourage the older men to come forward.
So then
She
you
kind of
have-
interceded for me.
Well, there's an element of trust, right? And the element of the field worker, and even if you've been there for 5 years, who are you?
I know.
You know,
So she was the one who opened that door. Yeah, this is the one in which the resemblance is kind of uncanny, I think. It looks like grandfather and grandson, but they didn't know each other. But Carolyn McKinstry, interceding on my behalf with the larger community because there were people who, when I invited them to come, started telling me stories that they remembered. That they said, I hadn't thought about this before. But as I sit here, I'm thinking about. So it was really bringing all these memories back.
Well, what you were doing was showing how history works in the present. And because history is never about the past. We're lying when we think it is, or we don't know, right? But what history does, or at least in my scholarly work, I think of history as the telling of history, right? Visualizing of history. It's always about the present. It's always about our present circumstances, and it tells us, in many ways, as much about where we are today as in this case, all of these people were in 1963, right? And so, you have this sort of extraordinary sort of piecing together of elements that presents, this sort of conglomeration of fact, how we remember, how we feel, how it affects us. And it works on multiple registers. And what I want to do, actually, before our time is up, because we're going to have to take questions to someone, is not forget about the Underground Railroad. Because there are so many similarities between what you have done here in terms of the research and in terms of the archival work, in terms of the kind of mining. Because what you did was you went down to Birmingham and you were mining, and you were finding things, you were learning. I mean, in a way, you did the work of a scholar. In a way, you did the work of a scholar, right? In sort of digging things up and interpreting and making something new, right? And I want to have a chance to talk with you about how that functioned with the Underground Railroad, which is a really similar yet different kind of project.
Okay.
And this is
So this is the original presentation of the Birmingham Project at the Birmingham Museum that opened almost exactly 50 years to the day. It opened September 2013. And of course, given the experience for the adults was a rather profound one.
Right.
To go from not being allowed in this museum to being on the walls of the museum, which was the other piece of it.
Yes.
So Birmingham and the years that I spent there really got me thinking more deeply about history and how history can be visualized or reimagined in the contemporary moment. I had made a trip to Cleveland, Ohio, thinking about what I might do there. There was one place that triggered that visit, Kozad Bates' house in Cleveland, Ohio. And then maybe in 2015-16, I was invited by Front International Triennial to make work for the Triennial, which opened last year. And I said, I'll participate, but only if I can continue this history project that I'm in the midst of. I don't want to do something else. I need to keep exploring this idea. Unfortunately, in Cleveland and northern and northeastern Ohio, there is significant history in relation to the Underground Railroad. So I started doing research. All of these history projects, as you said, the scholarship part is doing the research.
Yeah.
Because I just can't go and start making work. I have to do.
Well, you could, but it would be bad. It just wouldn't be very good.
And the Underground Railroad, as you know, was a system of support throughout the landscape that aided fugitive slaves as they moved through that landscape towards freedom. And in the case of Ohio, that move towards freedom was the move towards Lake Erie. And then from Lake Erie, the 50 miles across Lake Erie to Canada. So I started doing research, typing in addresses, doing Google Street View visits to some of these locations, just to see where they are, to see if they might be places that I might be able to make photographs of. But after that initial typing in of Underground Railroad, Cleveland sites, and coming up with a handful of addresses, which gave me a starting point. I continued to do more research, visiting these Underground Railroad sites. And mind you, I still have no clue, as when I started the Birmingham work, what the final form of this work is going to be. But the form follows the research and follows the narrative that I intend to create. So I start visiting sites. I visited the Western Reserve Historical Society, started doing research into whatever information they had about both the Underground Railroad and Underground Railroad records and slave narratives, just trying to steep myself in the place as much as I can before I start to deal with the question of, what are you going to do? What are you going to do? As I thought about this movement of fugitive black bodies through the darkness of the landscape, the idea of these black subjects within this black space. When you say black subjects and black space, it's kind of like said Roy de Carava.
I know, right?
Yeah, so de Carava became a conceptual
Yeah.
touchstone for this work. This idea of the black figure, the black subject, the black body, enveloped in this beautiful black space that they're both moving in and coming out of. And then Langston Hughes' poem, Dream Variation, which I knew, and the final line of that poem, Rested Pale Evening, a tall, slim tree, night coming tenderly, black like me. That blackness could be something tender. That black space did not have to be an intimidating, imposing. It could be tender. Blackness, tender space, the photographic image, Roy de Carava. So that was my conceptual beginning. I wanted to, with the information that I had, begin to make these nighttime landscapes, to create this beautiful black space through which these imagined fugitive black bodies are moving through, trying to imagine the space and the landscape from the vantage point or through the eyes of those who might have been moving through that landscape, which is what determines the positionality.
Yes.
You know, because in making photographs, there's always a fundamental question of where do you put the camera in relation to the scene.
Right.
And that actually has something to do with the narrative that you're trying to create.
Right.
So I wanted to make the photographs from the imagined position of what might have been the fugitive bodies moving through this landscape, starting with sites that were, to the extent that we know, Underground Railroad sites. Because the Underground Railroad, I say it's as much myth as it is fact.
Yep.
And it was never meant to be known exactly where these locations were. And that never meant to be known gives me the space to work in.
Right.
So I started in Cleveland, and I know these are very, you'll pardon me, they're difficult to see because they're dark. And there's a little, and there's light in this room, which makes it even more difficult to see.
Yeah.
But within Cleveland proper, much of what would have been the material culture and information of the Underground Railroad has pretty much, with the exception of Kozad Bates and maybe one or two other houses, been largely built over.
Right.
Initially by Case Western University, and then further by the Cleveland Hospital System. But as you go maybe a half hour, 45 minutes outside of Cleveland to Hudson, Ohio, which also played a significant role in the Underground Railroad. John Brown had a house out there, John Brown's Tannery. I mean, there was a large abolitionist community in Hudson, Ohio. So I started spending a lot of time in Hudson, Ohio, photographing the landscape there. Some of the sites, such as this one here, site of John Brown's saddlery, and this creek on Owen Brown Street. Owen Brown was John Brown's oldest son, who lived somewhere in this area. And this work, much like the Birmingham work, the subjects in those photographs are not the subjects who were killed on September 5th, you know. But what I do want is for people looking at that work to be almost inextricably drawn back to that moment, even as we know it's the contemporary moment.
And you also, but you're also, I mean, sort of along the lines of the fugitive, right? The person who's supposed to be able to just sort of go and be undetected. In the way that you have sort of marshaled de Carava and those really dark prints of his from the 50s and 60s, you also stage these as an exercise in seeing, because they're supposed to be hard to see. And so you're not, this is not mistaken. It's not, in my case, it would be a bad slide, right? But in your case, you're really just sort of mining this sort of really small area, right, of the photographic grays and blacks, right? As a way to, even if we're not a fugitive, okay, it looked like this, but if we're trying to see one running across the yard, we're going to be, you know, it's hard to see. It sort of takes on this character of the Underground Railroad as completely difficult to decipher. And that's compounded by the fact that so much of what we think we know as fact is not fact. That we have this sort of amazing marriage of fiction and fact. And
Fiction, fact, and a healthy dose of myth.
Yeah, and myth and all of that stuff right in there, and in a way, I mean, what it seems to me that you're doing what I would call an epic project, right? And the epic project, if we take Birmingham and we take Night Coming Tenderly Black and we take your current work, which I'm not going to give away, right? You're doing this really just sort of deep and interesting sort of mining of African American history. That this has been the direction of
that's my project,
right?
For now.
But this is the first project in which we don't see people. Talk to us about this being.
Yeah, it's
people-less.
interesting. In between the Birmingham Project and this work, I did another project called Harlem Redux.
Yeah.
It was a return to Harlem, which was the site of my first work in the 1970s. And Harlem Redux is actually the first project in which I begin to try to grapple with the challenge of making photographs that are about space and place, the narrative of space and place. And in that context, within a space that is shifting and changing, in which space memory is being disrupted, in which cultural memory is being disrupted, and how does one visualize that?
Right.
That's not a portrait of a person.
No.
So what is that? And it took me about a year and a half to be able to, I guess you could say, make the kinds of photographs that I was imagining in terms of these photographs about Harlem, and which here and there were people, but by and large, it's about the place. It was from working out this idea of visualizing the narrative of place that allowed me to then take that to Ohio, even though Harlem as the urban environment is something that I know a lot better than I do the wooded landscape of Hudson, Ohio, which I have no relationship to at all, other than the imagined one that's required to make the work. So this idea about moving away from the portrait actually begins with the Harlem Redux work, and then goes deeper with this work. And we'll continue with the next piece of this history project that I'm getting ready to start in New Orleans. And then I've been invited to do something in Virginia. So I'm just going to continue this deep dive into this visual reimagining of history, how to both invoke and evoke the past in the contemporary moment in a way that when the viewer engages the object. And these are rather large. These are 48 by 59. So the objects themselves have a physical presence to them, a kind of enveloping physical presence, an enveloping kind of darkness that one has to engage with as an object in front of you. But the move away from the portrait happened in Harlem. And it was, I have to admit, it was a difficult transition. There were moments of pure frustration.
Did you panic? Did you have a panic attack or anything like that? I would, because
it got pretty bad.
Yeah.
It got pretty bad.
Let's get real. Okay.
Because this was a new way of thinking and working for me.
Yeah.
So there were moments of real frustration, but you know, I just told myself, just keep working. Like the imperative to make the work dictated that I push through
Yeah.
that
Yeah.
and figure it out. But in all honesty, when I started that work and couldn't figure it out, there was a moment when I sat down and had a conversation with myself. I said, well, you've had a pretty good run.
I've had that same conversation with
If this
myself.
event
Last Tuesday.
yeah, if this event has to end, that's not a bad thing.
Right.
You've done pretty well for
Yeah,
yourself.
yeah.
You've got a lot to be proud of, so maybe this is it.
This is
Maybe.
it. And on that lovely note, all right, I'm going to, we'd like
And then
to.
I shook it off.
Then you
and got
shook it
back to
off and
work.
became fabulous. All right. So on that note, I would like to open up this venue for questions from our audience. And before we do that, I want to thank you.
Well, thank you.
For having lunch with us.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank all of you. And thank you, Stephen, for continuing this conversation that we've been having.
For a long time.
You know, so that we could share it with you guys.
Yeah. So we do have questions. We have people with microphones, and so if you raise your hands, we will call on you. Just wait for a mic before you start to speak. There's a question.
Yeah, and if I can't hear you, which I probably won't, he'll be my translator.
Yes.
Okay.
So we've got here and then
Is someone
here.
here?
Yeah, here and then here.
Has the Birmingham Project led to any discussion of that event 50 years later in either in Birmingham or other cities where it has shown?
Did the Birmingham Project lead to questions about what has happened 50 years later, either in Birmingham or somewhere else?
How so?
How so? In the community or in the museum?
Well,
or?
especially in Birmingham, since there are residents still living who lived through that, as well as the young people in school who may have studied it and heard about it, were there any church conversations or community discussions or his verbal historical remembrances?
Was there remembrances and testimonies in the churches and in the communities after you did your project?
Yeah, I maintain a very close contact and relationship with my community in Birmingham, and there have been periodic programs and remembrances. But I have to tell you, without going into great detail, that history is very complicated. Much more complicated than we know. And I'll just give you one example. That first weekend that I visited Birmingham and attended 16th Street Baptist Church, I went to service there that Sunday. And afterwards, I met the minister who was at the back door greeting people as they run out. And I introduced myself to the minister and told him that I was an artist, I'm a photographer, I'm thinking of coming here, making work. And he asked me, what are you thinking of making work about? And when I told him September 15th, even before I could get the year out of my mouth, he said, stop right there. Thank you for turning the lights on. Thank you. And he said to me, here at 16th Street Baptist Church, we're not about all that business. So we're not about all that business. He said, we're about the business of Jesus Christ. And he said, if you want to make some work about that, we'd be very happy to work with you. And I tried to, I was polite. I didn't roll my eyes or anything. I didn't, I hopefully didn't change my expression because, quite frankly, it's not my place to come from Chicago and tell him what his business should be. He lives there, I don't. But that's how complicated that history was. And at that time, and until the 50th year, there was not a marker for those 4 girls anywhere near that church, no monument. That it's a complicated history. And I think that gives you some suggestion as to just how complicated it is. Not everyone wants to go there. And if you, the best book to read about this is Taylor Branch, Parting the Waters.
Yeah.
For those of you, I met Taylor and had conversations with Taylor Branch. And the first time I went to Birmingham, had dinner with Taylor Branch, and I said, Taylor, I just came back from Birmingham. And Taylor said, interesting place, isn't it? I said, I met the minister at 16th Street Baptist Church. And what did he tell you? Like he kind of already knew. And he had done deep research there. And what did he tell you? With a little smile on his face. So that history is very complicated.
Yeah. There was a question here.
Hi, thank you very much for your work and for the talk, which was great. I was fortunate to see the piece in Cleveland, and I wonder if you could talk about the installation in the church, because I think, for me, that was a huge part of the experience as well.
The installation of...
England.
Yeah, I saw
Yeah.
it.
You have it. You have the images.
Oh,
Yep.
there it is. There it is. Yeah. When I completed the Underground Railroad project in Cleveland, it was installed in St. John's Episcopal Church. And St. John's Episcopal Church is, in fact, a known Underground Railroad station. It was called Station Hope during that time. It was the final place of that fugitive slaves took refuge in before going the final mile to Lake Erie. They would take refuge in the belfry of this church, and then they would, once they got the signal from Lake Erie. So I initially showed the work in the space of the history that I was making work about, which was also a very different way of thinking about the work and thinking about how to further enact and enliven the conversation with history. I don't know if there's maybe one more. No, that's my final borrowing quote. But yeah, so the final presentation of that work in the church was one more piece of my thinking about how to, take this reimagined history and place it in a site of the actual history. It's going to be shown next month for the first time in a museum setting. I'm showing this Underground Railroad-related project, Night Coming Tenderly Black, at the Art Institute of Chicago. So if anybody is either from Chicago or looking for a reason to go to Chicago, January 11th,
In the middle of winter.
it's going to open. And I've also curated a parallel exhibition of photographs from the Art Institute collection that would be in conversation with my photographs.
Yes.
Different photographs about the way the landscape has been visualized, and then extending that to the way the African American subject has figured in the American social and physical landscape. Yes, so thanks for asking about that. I forgot I had those slides.
We have a question here, and then Rachel in the back.
I just want to say I don't really have a question. I just want to thank you so much for this work. I love art, and I think this is the first time in my life that a piece of art has just touched me so deeply that only tears could express it. And when you made the statement that history is always about the present, those beautiful photos make me think of Tamir Rice and Michael Brown and what they will look like when they get to be my age. I'd never thought about it like that. I've studied history. I've been to 16th Street Baptist Church. I've done civil rights heritage tours all over the country. And I've never, ever thought, what would those young people look like if they were my age? Thank you for doing that.
Well, thank you. Thank you very much.
Rachel has her hand up in the back.
Thank you so much for your work and for the conversation that you've all had. I'm really curious about how space and the spatial construction of your photographs functions to collapse time and and to trouble this kind of linear notion of time, particularly in the Birmingham portraits, where if it weren't for the white line down the middle, they could literally be sitting next to each other in the same moment. But then also in the Underground Railroad pictures, this way that you photograph these spaces in through the eye of someone who was a fugitive slave, so that these photographs, which are taken in the present, just instantly transport us into the past. So I was just wondering if you could speak about space and time.
Well, it's interesting because I am, and have been for a very long time, even going back to my first project in Harlem, New York. I am aware that as much as my work is about my own set of ideas, my work has always been a place where others can speak through my work. And that is something that has informed my work for a very long time. That it's not just about me. I'm the shaper of it. I'm the intellectualizer of it. And I'm the one who brings this sense of the history of the medium and how photographs are made. I bring all of that to it. But ultimately, in terms of the way the work functions, I want the work to be a place where others can speak through my work, even as I'm speaking through them. So the them, in this case, is the fugitive black body moving through that space. I'm looking and seeing and thinking through them. And for those young people in Birmingham, I'm reimagining them. I'm trying to bring them back into being, so that they can be with us in a more palpable, tangible, resonant form. So that's a part of the larger construct of the work. I don't know how to really answer it any more deeply than you've already stated it, but thank you.
Thank you. There's a question right here.
Hi, Dawoud. My family was at the Civil Rights Museum in Birmingham in 2010 on a cross-country trip, and two things about it what I'd love you to respond to, and I was one that we were speaking with the employees who spoke very powerfully about how all of that past is still very much part of the present, was the first part, which you alluded to. And also the other thing was that I was most moved, or we were all most moved by all the auditory recordings of all the slanderous things that were being said towards African Americans back in that era, things that I thought I had long forgotten, but things that I actually had heard when I was growing up in the 60s and 70s. So I was wondering how the auditory recordings that I'm sure you probably listened to also affected your experiences down there.
How did the auditory experiences, hearing things, slanderous things about African Americans affect you when you were?
Specifically related to the project or just in general? Because for me, the South in general is a place where history is deeply present in a way that you can almost reach up and touch it and hold it and look at it. You can smell it in a way that in those places, like larger urban environments, where there's just a celebration of time. For me, being in Birmingham and hearing some of the stories that people told me, there was one story that I really remember. There was a woman who I was photographing, an older woman who turned out to not be the right age, so I couldn't use her photograph. But she told me, as I'm sitting here thinking about this, now that you're here, she said, I remember growing up, my parents never really talked to me about what was going on. See, and I think this is another one of the myths about the civil rights movement, that it was kitchen table conversation.
Yeah, no, it wasn't.
No, it was not. It was not. And there was not even large-scale participation in the movement on the part of African Americans in Birmingham, because you certainly risked your life being a part of the movement. It wasn't something that everyone did. And this woman told me, when I was growing up, I used to hear these sounds, these booms across the street. And I always wondered what they were, but my parents never said anything. And what those sounds were, back during that time, the nickname for Birmingham was Birmingham. People's homes, bombs are being set off by the Klan and the White Citizens Council regularly. So regularly that Birmingham was called Birmingham. And she said, the neighbor's house, something happened across the street at the neighbor's house. I didn't really understand what happened, but my parents didn't say anything. And the neighbor's house had been dynamited. And she said, I only realized later what it was, because if you wanted your child to be able to go out the door in the morning and go to school, participate in their lives as fully as possible, you didn't tell them everything that was going on. Or they would be so terrified that they would probably just hide under the bed and never come out. So there were a lot of things that were never spoken about. Adults might have spoken about it amongst themselves, but it wasn't like this was a conversation that was being widely had. Which I didn't quite have a sense of that until I started speaking to older people who said, my parents never told me anything. I only realized what was going on later.
And they didn't, even outside of Birmingham, I grew up in Boston. People weren't talking about it. But yeah, Michelle.
Hi. Thank you so much for this conversation. My question is about Night Coming Tenderly, which I was really struck by the beauty of the images. I felt like they were very poetic. And I love what you said about Blackness and tenderness. And I'm wondering, as the intellectualizer of the work, if you are writing about that concept, and if you could say a little bit maybe more about it. I think it's something that certainly we all need to be thinking about and heeding here.
What the concept of the black subject, the blackness,
Blackness
and materiality?
and tenderness.
The book is coming.
Okay. That's what I wanted to hear. Thank you.
The book is coming. He's one of the writers. I can't talk about it too much, but the book is coming.
Yeah, we're not talking about it yet. I saw a hand up right over here.
No, and we're going to be talking about exactly that. Materiality in relation to blackness, blackness in relation to narrative, materiality. It's going to be about all of that. It's something that I have thought about deeply in relation to that work. Thanks for asking. The book is coming.
It's coming. We swear.
Hi, I just have a curiosity. When you were creating the work, when you were in process, did you connect with any possible living family members or close friends of the people that died or were injured, and what were their impressions?
Did I connect
Did you connect with people, the families or relatives or close associates of people who died in Birmingham, and what were their responses?
It was difficult. It was really difficult. And here's why. The surviving sister, Sarah Jean Collins, whose sister Addie Mae Collins had been killed, she had, ever since 1963, been suffering, among other things, an extreme version of survivor's remorse. So there's the survivor's remorse, and also she had been, like any number of other people who were in the church when that explosion went off, she's been virtually disappeared from her own history. The narrative has been rather simplistically narrowed down to the narrative of 4 girls. There were 30-something people who were injured in the church when that dynamite went off. When I visited a school, and I met a man in the school and shook his hand, and his hand was deeply scarred. And I didn't remark on it, but he said, oh yeah, he said, I was in the church, my hand got all messed up by the flying glass. But in terms of seeking out people, I did want to meet the surviving sister, which was very complicated. She was in the midst of trying to get some kind of reparation from the city, some kind of restitution, some kind of acknowledgement. And during the time I was there at the 50th anniversary of that moment, which was her moment as much as it was anyone else's, it just got more and more difficult for her. She wanted interview fees for anybody. She was just looking for some attention, compensation, acknowledgement. It got very complicated. But the other person that I did spend a lot of time with was Reverend Carolyn Moore McKinstry, who was, as I mentioned, was also in the room with her friends when the explosion went off. And she and I had a lot of conversations about this because all of those survivors went through years of trauma, years of self-medicating to try to forget, just years of a very complicated life that they're not necessarily willing to share with a concerned stranger coming in from Chicago, as well-intentioned as I might have been. Because that's trauma that is still raw. It's still raw. You don't get over that or move on or however people think about that. So I didn't want to try to intrude too deeply because what I was getting from what Reverend McKinstry told me, it's way too complicated. Even for people in Birmingham to have that conversation with the families. Yeah, so it's not an open conversation. It's not something that is openly shared.
There's Gwen, and there's somebody up here. Hold on, get your mic.
After working, or while you were working on the Birmingham Project, did you ever have the opportunity to meet people whose ancestors had successfully navigated the Underground Railroad or whose families were instrumental in helping those people? And if you did they have any sense of how the Underground Railroad may have shaped or impacted their lives today?
No, not really. That I didn't. I tend to do as much research as I need to do my work. As much as there is a research component to the work, that's not my level of scholarship or even interest, really. What was interesting about the research that I was doing in Cleveland when I was at the research library, and I told the head librarian there that I'm looking to find some specific, places remaining in Cleveland that were known sites. I said I've found a few, but I'm looking for others, and I'm wondering if you might be able to provide any direction. And he told me, he said, if you find them, please let me know.
Exactly. People are extraordinarily hard to track down.
Yeah.
People whose family or from family and descendants of people who escaped and the like are extraordinarily difficult because trails go cold or people don't even know. Often they just don't know. And people are so on the move. And so even after the war, after the Civil War, people trying to find their families, there were ads in papers all over the US and Canada and Mexico. People looking for relatives who were either lost from having to flee or people who had escaped who were returning to try to find where their loved ones were. And so people just sort of dispersed. It was unbelievably difficult.
Yeah, there was, you probably remember better than I do, but very recently they were brought together. A number of ads that were placed in black publications by people who were looking to be reunited with their families.
Yes.
Just placing ads in black newspapers at the time, hoping that
they would find someone. There was a question here.
Yes, in the Birmingham Project, was there a dress code for the subjects? And if so, what was the rationale underlying the dress code?
I'm sorry, I missed the first part.
Was there a dress code for the subjects in the Birmingham Project? And if so, what was the rationale behind it?
I'm sorry.
Did you tell them how to dress your subjects?
Oh, in terms of how they, no,
Right.
oh, no. No, they came as they were. Usually, when I'm telling someone I want to photograph them, I give them the barest suggestion. I might say, just wear whatever you want, but you don't have to dress as if you're going to church. And I said, actually, it's probably a good idea if you don't dress as if you're going to church, because I want each portrait of the individual to have something of their everyday demeanor. I don't want everyone to show up in a black suit.
Why?
With some of the adults, of course, you tell an adult, come as you want. Yeah, they're not going to do that. But for the younger people, I told their parents, don't fuss over them too much. I just want them to come. I just want them to momentarily step out of their life, be photographed, and then they go back to their life. So I don't want them to look like they did anything in particular to be photographed.
The adult subjects look very well dressed to me, it seemed. That's why I asked the
It's
question.
a choice.
Yeah, some of them, everyone chose how they wanted to come. But I tried to nudge them away from putting on their Sunday best, because I didn't want the pictures to have that kind of uniformity.
I think we have time for one more question, and there's a man in the back.
Hi, I'm interested in.
Can you stand up?
Sure.
Thank you.
And since I'm standing, let me add my thanks to your presentation today. It's been wonderful. I'm interested in the intersection between organizing, art, culture, and social justice. And so to that end, I wonder how the civil rights organizations are using your work to advance the work that they're doing.
So the question is, our questioner is interested in the intersection of art, organizing, and social justice. And so to that end, he's interested in understanding how civil rights groups are using your work, if they're using it at all.
That's not my space. My space is the space of public presentation of the work as a very particular kind of object that are meant to provoke a conversation, but to be put to that kind of use, that's a different kind of work. So I don't claim to be working within that space, because there are people who are working in that space much more intentionally than I am. I don't make work to function at that level of specificity. Like, my work doesn't tell you what to do. You know, which a certain kind of work does. It demands that you do something. My work doesn't tell you what to do. It kind of provokes you to think. It kind of provokes you to a state of remembrance. It provokes you to a state of reflection. But whether it provokes you to a state of action, that probably depends on exactly who's standing in front of it. So that's not the space that I choose to work in. I'm not a photojournalist who does those kind of narrative stories, to build a story that implicates the viewer and demands that the viewer takes action. That's a very different kind of work, and I've never considered myself to be that kind of photographer or artist. I engage in the space of poetics. You know, I bring a sense of poetics to these historical and sometimes, you know, significant moments. I want the impact to be more reflective. I want people to reflect. I want it to have that kind of transformative capacity to cause people to stop and to reflect and then to go back out in the world. What they do, I have to leave that to them.
Dawoud, I want to thank you and Stephen for this incredible conversation. And I think whether you like it or not, your work spurs deep feeling and I'm sure action just by the questions that have been here today. What you said, Miss, on the end there about the history is always present, and we think about the Trayvon Martins and the people, what would they look like today? I mean, that is incredibly powerful. So you're teaching us how to think as individuals, as citizens, and as a society, whether you like it or not.
That was bossy.
So again, thank you so much. We bow to both Dawoud and Stephen, and to you. And thank you all for coming out today. We really appreciate it.
Thank you.